Sometimes I think that my only interview question is, what are you like? If you can answer that question, then I think you've got a very, very successful feature. And this doesn't apply just to musicians, it applies to almost anyone who you interview. If your reader walks away thinking, yes, they're like that, and I like them, don't like them, or I'm indifferent, that's neither here nor there. If your reader believes they are like that, then I think you've succeeded.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Paul Dodgson. Let me preface today's programme by telling you that for the last 25 years, whenever I've moved house, I've dragged behind me a large box containing back copies of the now defunct music magazine called Q. For those who don't know, Q was a monthly glossy mag packed full of features, interviews and reviews about contemporary music. Now, I could never quite face getting rid of them because I knew that one day they would come in handy, though I had no idea what would bring that about. Well, I'm pleased to say that day came last week when I started to research the work of today's guest, because instead of turning to the internet, I just had to turn around. It turns out that I had an archive of his writing 3 feet from my desk. So I'm very pleased to be joined in the studio today by an author, journalist, editor and broadcaster who's familiar to me through his writing about music, which goes right back to those old copies of Q magazine. He also writes a lot about sport, particularly football, which happens to be the subject of his latest book, Before You Go, a love letter to football that tells the story of a year in the life of the League One team Stevenage. But what makes this book special is that across the year, the author attends every single match, home and away, accompanied by Oscar, his teenage son. And the book is as much about their relationship as it is the beautiful game. More on that later, because now I need to say welcome to the author himself, John Aizlewood. Hello, John. How are you today?
I'm very well. Hello, Paul. What a lovely introduction that was.
Thank you. And those Q magazines, I knew they'd come in useful one day. Now, this episode of Collected is emerging into the world in June, which is traditionally the time of the Glastonbury Festival. Not happening this year, though, because it's the festival's fallow year. But I wonder, has Glastonbury been an important part of your calendar over the years?
Well, it has been occasionally. I have done Glastonbury in the mud. I've done Glastonbury in the rain. I've done Glastonbury in the sun. And I think my personal view is that bands sound better with a roof on. However, the Glastonbury experience is something else. Once you get in there, once you've gone through the traffic, once you've found a place to literally and metaphorically pitch your tent, then you can have the experience, not necessarily of a lifetime, but the experience of a year. You discover things, you discover people, you make friends.
And were you there in a professional capacity or as a punter?
Well, I went as a punter because weirdly, I happen to know people who lived in Glastonbury. And people who live in Glastonbury who support the festival, which is not necessarily all of them, if they do support it, then they get a host of concessions. And I kind of tagged along as a special guest with the locals. But I've also done it in a professional capacity too. And that brings its challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I wondered about that actually. In your capacity as a music journalist, how easy is it to strike the balance between being professional and joining in with the party?
Well, for me, it was always quite difficult because if I'm joining in with any kind of party, then it's actually quite difficult to churn out the written material. So at Glastonbury, I tended to have professional nights and unprofessional nights, and never the twain did meet mostly.
It's always a challenge when you take one art form, music, and then you try to convey it in another one, writing. Do you have any tips about how to go about that?
Well, there's always that old Frank Zappa quote saying writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And, of course, the old buzzard had a bit of a point. But you can't actually tell people what something sounds like, because the act of listening to music is inherently subjective. So therefore, you can put over your enthusiasm or your lack of enthusiasm for a particular product. But what I was really interested in terms of writing was these people's stories, how they got to the position where they are. I mean, working for Q magazine, which of course was the broadest of broad churches for music, it sort of had no kind of goggles on or anything. It didn't proselytize for different types of music. And this meant when I was there, I could write about and interview people whose music I didn't necessarily like. But a really good example is Kenny G, the blandest of bland saxophonists. He, unaccountably to my tender ears, was absolutely huge in America. So whether I liked him or not is irrelevant. But what I wanted to know was, what is Kenny G like? And is he as passionate? Is he as keen on his music as more predictable people like your Neil Finns, like your Kurt Cobains, like your New Order, choose anyone you want. And of course, the answer to that, Kenny G, is yes, in his own way. And of course, the best thing about Kenny G was that he had a dog who looked just like him.
And so it comes back to story, just like it does with so much.
Yes, everyone has their own story. Because I've always had this theory that if you stop someone on the street and interview them for an hour, then part of your, not just your interviewing technique and your writing technique, of course they could make it beautiful, but everyone has got stories to tell. Everyone has pivotal, important moments in their lives. It might be about work, it might be about relationships, it might be about actual incidents, be they tragic or euphoric, but everyone has a tale to tell. And I think as a writer, then your job is to not just to tell that tale, because that makes you just a cipher, but to actually build that picture and to tell someone's story and to make them interesting, because people are inherently interesting.
Absolutely. Well, look, let's pause Kenny G's saxophone for a moment, because we're going to make our first visit to the Royal Literary Fund Sound Archive, which is a treasure house full of writers talking about the writing life. And this is a particularly apt piece, as this is the National Year of Reading, a UK-wide campaign designed to inspire more people to make reading a regular part of their lives. We're going to hear from Kerry Young, British novelist who was born in and spent her early years in Jamaica, and whose work includes the novels Pow, Gloria and Show Me a Mountain. Here, she tells us about that moment when a book changed her life.
I wasn't much of a reader when I was young. Actually, I came to England at the age of 10, barely able to read, and with little interest in doing so. The great works that my mother urged upon me didn't help. Charles Dickens, Emily Bronte, Jane Austen. She'd been educated in an extremely upstanding convent school in Jamaica, my mother, so she extolled the virtues of the classics. That was her idea of proper English literature. It was what she thought an educated child should read. I didn't. I just concentrated on the certainties of physics, chemistry, and mathematics, in the belief that a sound knowledge of matter and its motion, the structure and properties of substances, and differential calculus was all I needed to get by. Then at the age of 17, for some reason that to this day I still cannot fathom, I borrowed a book from my sister. It was James Baldwin, Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. I devoured it. I just lay on the sofa and read it non-stop until it was done. That novel changed my life. How? Why? Because it was the first time I saw in a book something that connected to some semblance of my own experience. It felt alive and real. It felt meaningful. Someone had written about not being white. Someone had exposed the brutalizing experience of being black in a white world, how it felt and what it did to a person's sense of self, body and soul. So I read Go Tell It on a Mountain, Another Country and Giovanni's Room. But these books weren't just about being black or gay. They were about being human and what has to be understood, reconciled, challenged, acquired, and achieved in order for a person to retain their humanity. Against all odds. Later on, it was Zora Neale Hurston, Bushi Yamashita, Audre Lorde, Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, Maxine Hong Kingston, Amy Tan, and Han Su-yin. And as I read, what I realized was what I had suspected all along, that since I landed on these shores at the tender age of 10, I had been living in exile. When I got to Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, I learned two things. Firstly, that pain can be written, not only to show the wounds on the skin, but also the desolation deep in the heart. Secondly, we can write just for ourselves. As writers of color, we can tell our own stories for ourselves, not for or primarily for the white reader or white gaze. William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, and The Sound and the Fury taught me that it was possible to write about racism and relationships between black and white people, and to tell it how it is without blame or rancor. It was possible to observe without bitterness or resentment. It reminded me of the importance of seeking to see the basic humanity of people, and it made me realize that whatever our flaws and frailties, we are redeemable. So when I came to write all of those years later, it was of home, Jamaica, where life was real and where through fiction I could begin to make sense of myself.
That was Kerry Young there, and I loved her description of her journey from reader to writer. I wonder whether you have a life-changing moment like that that happened with a book that you could tell us about.
Yes, I do. It was an advertisement in, I think, the New Musical Express. And it said there was this new book out. And if you sent in your name and address, they would send you a free copy. Now, I, at this point, was about 14, 15, hadn't read anything or really since C.S. Lewis, the Narnia stories at school. However, this book, which was called The World According to Garp, by John Irving, whom, of course, I had never heard. I just fancied a free book. I sent off for it. Amazingly, the book came back brand new, and I read it. And yes, that book changed my life. And like Kerry said, the act of reading this particular book changed my life. It was extraordinary. It was a whole new world. Yes, it was American, and I was just a boy from Rotherham. It taught me things. It taught me very much. It taught me what sex was like. Admittedly, it was in the book. It was sex with his sister, but it was the best sex education I'd had. But the story, the tragedy, the way things fitted together, the kind of affirmation at the end. This was a book that took me to another world. And I quickly found out that it wasn't John Irving's first book. I went back and got the others. And every time, because luckily John Irving was at that point very, very prolific, his new books came out. And from there, I bought all his books and then began to discover the literary world around me. Where had this John Irving world come from? Who else can I read? And it does. It's a terrible cliche, but it's only cliche because it's true. Reading takes you to another, mostly better world. It opens your eyes. It confirms some of the things which you've been thinking, but it also explains in beautiful ways, because John Irving in particular was a beautiful, beautiful writer, how different worlds can interact. And I knew I could never be as good as that. But I think that was the moment when I thought, writing, essentially it's about putting some words in the right order. But what order do you use? What words do you use? And maybe, perhaps, I can do something like that with my life.
Oh, so you can trace it back to that advert in the New Musical Express. Yes,
that was an absolutely vital moment in my life. And I was only after a free book. But who cares? Because with writing and with reading, it doesn't matter how you get into it.
Yeah.
That's not important. Everybody's journey is different. People discover literature in so many different ways. They discover the beauty and the joy of reading and perhaps writing in so many different ways. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's the end result and the love of reading and perhaps writing that it brings. That's the important
I
part
noticed
of it.
in your book, Before You Go, there's a little mention of a bookshop in Rotherham where you used to loiter, to use your own word. And I wondered whether that had a role in you becoming a reader and then a writer.
Absolutely. This place in Rotherham was called, it definitely was called, because it no longer exists, unfortunately. It was called Harper's. And it was just opposite the main church in the centre of town. And I would go there and, I would loiter. I can still remember the layout of the books now. I remember where the kids' books were because I was buying the Narnia stuff that I'd been read to in school. And then later, after I discovered John Irving, then I knew where the adult section was. I knew where this whole new world was. And I'd just hang around there and I'd look at the backs and think, I can't afford that, but actually I might be able to afford it in a couple of weeks. But also, because the people who work in a local bookshop, because they love books, they noticed that I was loitering there. They'd say hello. They wouldn't force me out because they knew that I was absolutely interested in this. And I think you need somewhere like that as a child. And how the books were stacked, how they you could see the spines of them, how beautiful they looked as well. And it's a kind of very sensual, sensory experience.
Yeah, absolutely. They smell, don't they? The shops like that had a smell.
Absolutely,
But
yes.
do your children read? Are they readers?
I'd like my children to be reading a lot more than they do. But my daughter, my 18-year-old daughter, at the moment, she's reading The Virgin Suicides. My son Oscar, he will read biographies of Formula One drivers. And they can find their own way. Because they're teenagers, anything I suggest, they are simply not going to read because I've suggested it. But they will go their own way. And they're avid readers. They read political things on the BBC. They've got they're coming out, as it were, politically, and they're reading everything on the internet. They don't buy newspapers. They don't buy magazines. They're slightly shocked that I work for such archaic institutions, but they consume their information and they take their pleasure from reading in different ways. And like everything else, I think that this will balance. There'll be a balance. People will always read because it's inherently a pleasurable experience. And yes, of course, something like the Year of Reading is absolutely crucial in this. It needs a raised profile, but it always has to be carrot rather than stick because it's beautiful. It's a fantastic thing, reading as well as writing.
Let's move on now to talk a little bit more about your work writing about music. How did that become a specialism for you?
It became a specialism, writing about music, because I was at university and I was beginning to realise that I had no discernible talent other than stringing some words together. I also wanted to meet pop groups and I wanted to talk to them. I really wanted to talk to them. I didn't want to be a fan. I wasn't that interested in that kind of area. And bands played at my university. And I realised that you could go and interview them and they'd talk to you. And I thought that was absolutely incredible. And better still, and I think every music journalist says that, particularly at the beginning of their career, that you got free records because the music industry at that time was huge. And they were keen on developing the student market because students bought records and went to see concerts. And so I tapped into that. And I found that I enjoyed interviewing bands and singers. And I also found that my taste in music wasn't particularly tribal, that I could find interesting things to write about in nearly all the music that I heard. And I just thought it was something that I'd be able to do because, and this sounds like false humility, but it's not, because I couldn't do anything else.
So going back over some of your interviews from the late 90s and early 2000s, I noticed a pattern in the writing. So when you talk to Peter Gabriel, you start the feature with a description of him making tea with fresh ginger. And when you interview Kate Bush in a restaurant in Harrods, you describe her interaction with the waiter as she negotiates moving to another table. And I wonder if this is a technique to kind of puncture the bubble of stardom, to kind of humanise the subject.
It's not to puncture the bubble of stardom, because the people you've just mentioned, Peter Gabriel and Kate Bush, irrespective of whether you like them personally or not, or one likes them personally or not, then you can't puncture that bubble of stardom because of who they are, what they've done and how long they've been doing it for. But what you can do, instead of saying, tell us about your new album, which of course they're very keen to do, weirdly, but much less keen to talk about their old albums, but you can see a little bit of what they're like, because your interaction with them isn't just sitting down with a tape recorder in a location mundane or exotic or whatever. There's other things. It's how they treat people. It's the bit almost before the interview, and your examples that you're choosing there. Peter Gabriel making ginger tea. That's who he is, how polite he is about it. Kate Bush being incredibly polite. She's one of the most polite women I've ever met, but she's also quite a forceful woman in a really polite way. So you use the phrase negotiating to find a better table. She wasn't negotiating. There was no negotiation. She was getting a more suitable table. And that's kind of who she is. You're not, for the most part, you're not just with them in a hotel room for 45 minutes. If you are, then fine, take what you can from then. But if you're in Harrods with Kate Bush, then you can learn an awful lot about Kate Bush. You can share an awful lot of things about Kate Bush, which you won't actually get from interviewing Kate Bush.
By observing and reporting on her interactions with the world.
Yes, there's everything around her. And it sounds almost egotistical, but it's not. But it's part of good writing that you're showing people what are they like.
It's show, not tell, isn't it?
Yes. Sometimes I think that my only interview question is, what are you like? If you can answer that question, then I think you've got a very, very successful feature. And this doesn't apply just to musicians, it applies to almost anyone who you interview. If your reader walks away thinking, yes, they're like that, and I like them, don't like them, or I'm indifferent, that's neither here nor there. If your reader believes they are like that, then I think you've succeeded.
And the impression we often get as a reader from features like the ones I've described is of a very intimate encounter with the subject of the interview. But how much of what you experienced actually made it onto the page?
It depends on how long you spend with someone. If you're, say, with Peter Gabriel, you get your allocated couple of hours. And obviously that means that a lot of what you see and observe goes in. If, say, it doesn't happen now, but when people like myself were getting sent to America all the time and you spend a week with someone, then yes, then you can be much more selective. The longer you spend with someone, the more that you do with them, then the better your piece will be. I mean, for example, I was in UB40 for about 40 minutes because we went to Indonesia. And in Indonesia, then the religious laws are quite strict. And there was certain parties in government who were not keen on UB40 performing. And they wanted a meeting with the band. And the band, to their immense credit, says, right, you're in UB40, come to this meeting with us. So I was in this meeting with these kind of quite hardcore religious guys. And Ali and Brian from the band, they're saying, we just sing about peace and love and we have no political affiliations whatsoever. And of course, I chirped in as another member of UB40. And if you can actually write about something like that, which is a fantastic experience to be offered and to undergo, then you're getting a much broader picture rather than, again, saying, tell us about your new album.
So you're a character within the piece, aren't you, yourself? I mean, perhaps prefiguring the way that creative non-fiction has evolved over the years, because we're talking about something that happened sort of 26 years ago. But you are very much an integral part of the piece. You're not a neutral voice.
It depends on access completely. If you, like I said, if you're doing 40 minutes in a hotel room, you are not like that at all. If you're doing much longer in different circumstances, I mean, the thing about Q, because Q had influence and clout in those days, it could say, actually, we're not doing an hour in a hotel room, thanks. However, if you take us to an event, I remember doing a tour of American radio stations with Travis. If you do something like that, or I'm sleeping on Texas's tour coach, if you do something like that, then you, as a band, will get a better piece. And they couldn't say no because Q had so much clout and influence. And I think at Q, we used that influence very, very well to get better writing.
And has that all changed now?
Well, the music industry seems to be in, I think, terminal decline. There isn't the money that there was to send people such as myself to America for a week. They just simply will not do it. They can't afford to do it anymore. And this means, I think it's blanded, if that's a word. It's blanded music journalism because there isn't that access.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves the chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
Time now for our next visit to the Sound Archive. This time, we're going to hear from the playwright Claire Bailey on a topic that could be the mastermind specialist subject for many of us, rejection.
I was brought up with the old-fashioned notion that no means no, and if you have to try too hard, you're clearly a loser. When I first dipped my toe into the world of playwriting, people said yes and invited me in. Then, later, they didn't. The no's were humiliating, a body blow. I reacted with furious hauteur. I wouldn't approach them again until they were begging for my work. I'd always reacted similarly in love. The last resort of the spurned lover is to spurn first. You don't want me? You can't have me anyway. That wasn't always successful, but the one power you have in a dying romance is to walk away. Later again in my writing career, one particular gatekeeper even stopped bothering to say no. They just didn't respond at all. They were being paid a salary to respond to writers, and I was a writer with a track record, so I was bemused by their behaviour. The rage was building over a period of months, probably stoked by subterranean rejections of all sorts, going back to childhood, to the womb, to before the womb, to legions of unplacated ghosts of ignored women and writers over the centuries. Finally, I cracked. I woke up one morning and I thought, right, that's it. I'm giving up writing altogether. Then they'll be sorry. I was rejecting the rejectors. It felt terrific. It felt powerful. They didn't want my work. Fine. I wasn't going to write it anyway. Ha! Then they'd see. That lasted a couple of hours. And then came the awful, inevitable realization. They didn't care if I rejected them. They didn't care if I never wrote another play in my life. They might not even notice. Nobody was going to call me up saying, please don't do this, we need your plays. No, they wouldn't care. But I would. The thought of never writing again was unthinkable. What would I do with all the long, dull, empty hours of my life stretching ahead of me? Who was I if not a writer, and what could I do? The ideas wouldn't stop coming just because I'd beaten the rejectors at their own game. At first, I wanted to get treatment, aversion therapy perhaps. Electrics shock me every time a little idea creeps into my brain. Stop those writerly urges. Stamp out the desire to tell stories. Gradually, I realised that I didn't want to stop, and that they weren't going to stop me. Just as they can't stop someone falling in love. In the end, I understood that my rejection of the rejectors was liberating after all. I don't write for them. I've stopped trying to provide what I think they want. I'm allowing myself to try things out, experiment, develop, be brave. And I've clocked that successful people don't let rejection stop them. They just keep pushing at the closed doors until one gives way. Inua Elams told me that in Nigeria, if someone says no to you, it's simply a sign that you've asked either the wrong question or the wrong person. All you have to do is keep asking until you find the right person, and they will give you the answer you want. So it's not me, it's them. That's what I try to remember.
That was Claire Bailey. John, did anything in that piece resonate with you? How do you deal with rejection?
I admire Claire's approach of rejecting the rejectors. Frankly, and we must be honest here, I find it difficult, and I always have. And I started out, of course, before there was this newfangled internet thing, which meant that you had to call people up on the telephone. And I found that incredibly difficult, not least because my voice would suddenly go 2 octaves up. And I didn't enjoy that. I didn't enjoy that at all. Even now, when it's taboo now to call people on the telephone, then I find any kind of email rejection difficult. I always have. Not in terms of, as Claire was saying, like I'm going to stop writing and cause of resentment building up. It's just, it's downbeat. It's disappointing. And yes, I'll carry on. I'll have some more ideas, of course, because I don't have a dramatic response to it. But even now, all these years later, when someone doesn't reply, that's disappointing because you never know when to go back. You have to send this email going, I wondered if you happened to see my email of ... And of course they have. And they may have forgotten about it, and sometimes that happens. They say, well, thank you for reminding me. Yeah, sorry, well, let's do stuff. But for the most part, they haven't forgotten about it. They have just ignored it, partially because people who commission, people in the power of commissioning, do get so many things. And I know that at any given point in my life, there's always sort of 2 people or 2 magazines or 2 newspapers or 2 whatever that I'm unsuccessfully trying to seduce. And that's happening now as it did at the turn of the century. And yes, it is difficult. And of course, as Nietzsche has said, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. I'm not sure it does. I think it slightly diminishes us every time. And yes, I'd like it easy. And I'd love people to say, God, thank you very much for suggesting something. I've been waiting for you. And it's almost because I've been too busy that I haven't got in touch. That doesn't happen. You have to make things work for yourself. And it's hard, and it is getting harder because journalism is shrinking. Writing is shrinking, unfortunately, tragically, awfully.
And I think, moving on from that point, I think rather like Claire, I went through a period of people saying yes to a lot of things at the start of my writing life. But as I've got older, I have noticed the rejections are more frequent. Now, I know it's a difficult thing to talk about, but are you aware of the rejections becoming more frequent with age?
I think so. I mean, there was a time, which I think you're describing for yourself, where all the lights turned green. And you were just sailing through and people were going, yes. And they were saying thank you. of course, I've been waiting for you. And that period, you think, of course, that it's going to go on forever. You don't see that around the corner is a red light because you're too busy enjoying going through the green lights. And ultimately, then I think that there's a period at the beginning where you're rejected all the time. There's a period where the green lights come on, and then there's a period where the red lights start. And I feel that I'm very privileged at the moment to write for the people who I do write for. I write for the Sunday Times, the Radio Times. I write for Mojo magazine, Classic Rock, all magazines and newspapers at the top of their game. But it never feels like it's quite enough. And I feel like even now, after all these years, that I have to expand. I have to try different outlets, avenues and alternatives. And like you, I think, Paul, then yes, there are fewer rungs on the ladder.
I mean, does it keep you awake at night, or have you learned to live with it?
You have to learn to live with it because, like you, I've been doing this a long time. And if it kept you awake all night, I'd have had no sleep for 30 years. But yes, it still rankles. That's the life. That's the life that we've chosen. If we were working in different areas, perhaps more predictably, then yes, we wouldn't get that. But then we wouldn't be writers.
Yeah. And what advice would you give to somebody who's being rejected and is fed up?
If it destroys you, and I know this is not the helpful advice you're looking for, if it destroys you, stop, because you have to think about other things. However, if you are a writer in your soul, if you are someone who believes completely, then it won't destroy you. It may not make you stronger, but change your ways slightly. Do not be afraid of rejection. I always tell people, and people do ask this as if I've got some kind of magic key to this, because I haven't got one for myself. However, blitz, because the more you send, yes, you'll get more rejections, but no one who you've not contacted, no one who you've not attempted to do things with, they haven't rejected you if you haven't contacted them. Blitz, and someone at some point may say yes. And I was always fueled by fear of, one, getting a proper job, two, the understanding that I couldn't do anything else. I mean, you wouldn't want me to change the fuses in your house, Paul, because then I don't think you'd survive the night.
Well, I'd enjoyed talking about your time on Q magazine.
Yes, as we sizzled. And so there was always that, there was a mixture of sort of, with me, fear and determination. And look, it will happen because it did happen. And so therefore, I haven't lost any of my enthusiasm. I haven't lost any of the joy of writing, of the kind of uplift that it can bring, which is an extraordinary feeling. It's a for me, I don't know about you, Paul, but for me, it's a physical feeling.
Absolutely, yeah.
That when you've written something, one, that you know is good, and two, that you know is going to go where it's meant to go. That's an incredible feeling. I don't think people get that if they're bailiffs.
Well, talking about writing from the soul, you mentioned that soul writing a few moments ago. I think it's a good time to now talk about your latest book, Before You Go, which does feel like it's written from a sort of very deep place within you. Can I start by asking you to give me a little summary of what it's about?
The book is called Before You Go, and it's about me and my teenage son, who last football season went to every home and away game of the mighty Stevenage in League One, who are a small club, the smallest club in League One budget-wise. They've got the smallest away support. And myself and Oscar went to every game. And the book is sort of seen through his eyes as this boy who's doing these remarkable things with his dad. But it's also, obviously, he isn't the narrator at all. It's completely me. It's also about our relationship. And as we traverse the country watching this League One team. And there are set things in the book. We have a pie and food at every ground. We talk about predictions. We talk about the team. We meet fans. We don't meet the players. It wasn't involved with the club in any way, although thankfully they like it and they sell it in their club shop and they've had us on their website, mercifully. It was just something that we had to do then. It's called Before You Go because, for example, we couldn't do it this season because Oscar's taking his GCSEs. And then after that, who knows? So it's this moment in his life.
And it was, I think, a lovely thing to do to capture that time in Oscar's life. But I wondered whether there was much negotiation involved in order for that to happen. I mean, did you have a contract about what you could and couldn't say and report?
No, we didn't, except, without contradicting myself, yes, we did. He was very much aware that what we talked about in the car on our own as we were travelling back from Stockport at 2:00 in the morning, that it was all part of the book. I explained it to him and I said, do you want to read it beforehand? But you can't change anything, which he thought was an unfair offer. And of course, he's completely right. But that's
And did
what
he?
writing's
Did he
about.
read it?
No, he chose not to. But since it came out, he hasn't read it either.
Ah.
Because by his own admission, and this makes me slightly uncomfortable as I'm talking about writing, he doesn't want to read what I say about him. And I'm completely happy with that, actually, because it's not for him now, really. It's for him in 20, 30 years when I'm not around, when he's got his own children. And when you talk about, as a boy, I think the relationship with your own father, that when you meet the people that you fall in love with, when you meet the people who you have relationships with, one of the first things they say is, what was your dad like? And people ask me that about my own father, and it's so difficult to explain. And I wanted him to have something where he could say, look, when I was 14/15, this was our relationship. This was this thing that we did together. And I think he'll show it to his own children.
It sounds as if you're writing for a very niche audience, and that audience being your son.
There is that aspect. However, I think that anyone who has had a son, anyone who has had a father, which obviously means everyone, then hopefully they will see something in that relationship. And if they happen to like League One football too, then great, because there's loads of that stuff in there. I don't think anyone's written quite so extensively about the wonders of Carl Piagiani.
There is a lot of, and I wanted to ask you about to sort of just push you on this, because I mean there is a lot about League One football, and which perhaps does restrict the audience a little bit, or the readership a little bit. Are you consciously doing that? I mean, because you could have written this in a way that was aimed at a mass market audience. But I mean, I think, there's a lot of detail there, isn't there, about Stevenage and about the players and about the management and about the tactics. Were you conscious that you were perhaps writing for a smaller audience?
I think what you're saying is a fair point, unfortunately. Not that I don't want the book to sell. Of course I do. I'm delighted and flattered and honoured when anybody has bought it and tells me what they think of it. But I think in terms of writing, you have to be true to yourself. And I wanted to write a book about that relationship between father and son. And it would have been false to do it any other way. I mean, and yes, when he was younger, I certainly induced him into following Stevenage. I had this idea for some time, and I thought that this was the way forward. If we'd done it for, say, a Premier League club, yes, it would have opened things up, but it wouldn't have been true. It wouldn't have been true. And if you're writing, particularly if you're writing a book, you have to, I think, retain that essential truth of yourself. I mean, every reaction of Oscars that I record, the kind of euphoria when Stevenage do something which seemed so unlikely, like winning away at Wrexham, which after that, then I kind of describe it as some kind of euphoric experience. It was almost religious. And I couldn't have got that if he didn't feel genuinely about it. And then there were other times, such as when we went to Crawley, and it was a wretched, rotten evening from Stevenage's point of view. And Oscar was so downbeat and so glum too. But all these feelings that I recorded were absolutely genuine. And I felt that I could put it into words how a 15-year-old boy felt, how personally he took it. But to his credit, you talked about a contract before. The only aspect of a contract was that we would do every game, whatever happens. And mercifully, and to immense credit to him, he never backed out of that. And there was never no. It was always, yes, how are we going to do this? And as a 15-year-old boy, he missed social events. He missed his friends' birthday party, which is a big thing when you're 15. And they were going go-karting. They were going to Nando's. Perfect day. All that with his friends. And he turned it down.
But he's got a book.
Yeah, yes.
The chicken will have passed, but the book will remain forever.
Yes, he's got that forever. You know, of course, I'd like it to sell as many copies as possible, as I said, but it's for him, it's for our family, but it's for anyone who's had a relationship, anyone who's had a father-son relationship.
And I mean, one last thing before we move on. You know, I used to write for television where the audience was in the millions, but I've also sort of written and performed a show that I've taken around people's living rooms where they were just about double figures. And actually, I know which one is the most satisfying, and it's not the TV. Obviously, financially, it's a completely different story, but artistically, the satisfaction was definitely in the latter. And I wonder whether there is something valid about making art for a smaller audience that are appreciative of it, rather than necessarily always trying to go for the big market.
There is. I think you can do both. You were saying about you writing for television. Yes, of course, that's a big market, and therefore to be successful, it has to appeal to a big market. You're taking a show to people's living room, then there's a different kind of satisfaction. And I gave up quite a lot of writing to do before you go, because I couldn't write about football matches anymore, because I was now taken by going to see Burton Albion and Stevenage rather than the Premier League games, which I'd been used to doing as a football match reporter. I just felt I had to do that, because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes writers are pirates, you know? They're doing things because it feels great and because it's the right thing to do. And yes, I knew I'd regret this from, say, a financial point of view. But sometimes you have to do something which is incredibly true to yourself. And that satisfaction, as you were alluding to, the satisfaction from that is immense. Obviously, it's not going to help my pension, but you've got to do the right thing.
Good, thank you. I'm glad you said that. I'm taking that on board. Now here's Anne Morgan with the latest RLF news.
A literary prison memoir and a selection of poems by a 19th century beneficiary of the Royal Literary Fund are among the latest titles from RLF Fellows hitting the bookshop shelves. Rooted in the 2020 Belarusian uprising, Hannah Komar's new book, When I'm Out of Here, Staying Human in a Dictator's Jail, bears witness to the role of art under dictatorship, weaving together the diverse stories of women detained for peaceful protest in the nation's crowded prison cells. It is published by Scarina Press. Meanwhile, some poems by Thomas Hood, selected and introduced by Alex Wong, has been published by Headless Poet Press. Remembered chiefly for his outrageous punning and for his poems of social conscience, RLF beneficiary Thomas Hood, who died in 1845, was one of the most popular British poets of his time. This short selection, curated by current RLF fellow Alex Wong, includes well-known poems such as I Remember, and The Song of the Shirt, as well as less familiar pieces, and a substantial critical introduction that makes the case for Hood's enduring value and eccentric genius. For more information, visit the publishers' websites. Cornwall, York and Middlesbrough will play host to RLF Collected live events this month. At 10:30am on Wednesday the 10th of June, Peter Oswald, Rebecca Tantony and Ros Watkins will gather at St Agnes Miners and Mechanics Institute in Cornwall to present a live creative writing panel on the theme Letters to My Younger Self. Then at 6pm on Friday the 19th of June, York's Poetry Pharmacy will see Tarmina Ali, Bob Beagrie and Harry Mann discussing how reading and writing poetry has made them who they are. Finally, at 2pm on Thursday the 25th of June, Northeast-based writers Ishi Din, Karina Rodney and Harry Mann will explore whether literature can change your life. Drawing on the Royal Literary Fund's archive of pieces by hundreds of writers exploring the creative process, these hour-long events are free to attend. They will end with a Q&A, giving everyone the opportunity to join in the conversation. A novel by a Royal Literary Fund Fellow has been shortlisted for the 2026 Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. The judges commended Rachel Seifert's novel Once the Deed is Done for its exploration of the little-told story of the millions of slave workers imported into Nazi Germany from Ukraine, Russia and Poland. Other titles on the shortlist include The Pretender by Joe Harkin and The Matchbox Girl by Alice Jolly. The winner will be announced on Friday the 12th of June. And finally, an RLF Fellow is one of 8 recipients of Yale's 2026 Wyndham Campbell Prizes, receiving $175,000 in recognition of her life's work. One of 2 winners in the fiction category and the only UK recipient, Gwendolyn Riley received the prestigious accolade for her oeuvre of short novels, including First Love, Cold Water, My Phantoms and The Palm House. She's already a recipient of the Betty Trask Award, the Somerset Maugham Award and the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. Designed to call attention to literary achievement, the Wyndham Campbell Prizes provide writers with the opportunity to focus on their work independent of financial concerns. For more information, visit wyndhamcampbell.org. And now, back to the studio.
Thanks, Anne. And that's it for this edition of Collected. So it just remains for me to say a big thank you to our guest, John Aizlewood, for the insights he's given us into his writing life. If you have any comments about this programme or anything else you want to say or suggest, then please do get in touch with us on social media using the hashtag RLFCollected. But for now, this is me, Paul Dodgson, saying goodbye.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.